Hey there, everyone. I hope you are doing well. This week, we're going to be looking at Chapter 9, Environmental and Occupational Epidemiology. Now, hopefully, what you're noticing now is we are exploring some different topics related to epidemiology. Many of these topics that come from the textbook are areas that probably we aren't primarily going to be working in. And I do this on purpose is one, to kind of expose us to some different things within epidemiology, and two, to get you hopefully feeling like you've got more time, like you're not trying to put a lot of effort into memorizing this stuff or really kind of trying to comprehend it for purposes of your project. So as we're working on things, yes, there's going to be homework. Yes, there's going to be discussion topics. There are going to be things I think are relatively easy at this point. There are uh, things that you're kind of repeating, some of the things you've done before, kind of that repetition to develop mastery. Really be putting a lot of effort into your preparation for your week 9 assignments. So if we take a look here, this week there's a discussion and there is a homework due on Sunday. Probably going to be 2 screencasts. I'll shut this one off around the 20-minute mark. And then I've got a short, maybe 5-minute thing on your final project. So that is a discussion about what we're expecting. And there is also an example of something that somebody had done previously this term, or not this term, previously in this class. And then there's also a link to more on posters. There has been some questions about posters, and just want to get you thinking about how to create a good poster, what that looks like. And so we just go into a little bit more depth there. Here's the discussion topic for this week. You're going to propose a research study and study design to assess risk in an environmental or occupational setting. So probably for the majority of us, we're going to be thinking about like an occupational setting. Include the following in your post: the population and setting, the length of the study, and the exposures. So what I might present, well, actually, it's at the end of the screencast. So at the end of the screencast, we'll give an example on what that looks like. And your homework is on Canvas, and turn that in by Sunday, please. All right, so key messages for this chapter. The environment in which we live and work strongly influences the causation of disease and injury. Exposures to environmental factors can be quantified as a dose, which is used to establish dose effect and dose response relationships. Health impact assessments are used to forecast the likely health impact of major human interventions in the environment. Injury epidemiology has been used to identify which specific preventative actions are most likely to be effective. All right, so most diseases are either caused or influenced by environmental factors. We need to understand the ways in which specific environmental factors can interfere with health to design effective prevention programs. Environmental epidemiology provides a scientific basis for studying and interpreting the relationships between the environment and population health. Occupational epidemiology deals specifically with environmental factors in the workplace. All right, so now physical injuries are strongly dependent on factors in the living or working environment, but are also strongly determined by behavioral factors. Now, we use the term accident a lot. Accident is often applied to events that precede an injury, but that term accident can be misleading. as the word accident implies a random event rather than a combination of predictable causal factors. So in this chapter, the authors use the term environment as a broad term for all factors external to our bodies that may cause disease or injury. So different environmental factors that may affect health are shown here in table 9.1. Psychological. How does stress, how does unemployment, how do human relationships impact health? Biological, those things that affect us. Physical, climate issues, noise, radiation. You get the idea there. There's also then categories for accidental and chemical. The environmental and occupational health field includes a large number of specific and proximal causal factors using the concepts described for hierarchies of causes that the authors presented in the chapter Causation in Epidemiology. The hierarchy of causes in environmental and occupational health are presented on this slide. So there are driving forces behind current health environment trends. How does poverty and equity affect health? Science and technology, economic development, major human activities affect environmental quality. Poor environmental quality, things like air pollution, availability of quality food, housing or lack of housing. How do these things all potentially affect health? So, why study environmental or occupational epidemiology? Well, 25 to 35% of the global burden of disease may be caused by exposure to environmental factors. Major health problems are associated with things like unsafe drinking water and sanitation, indoor air pollution due to biomass energy use for cooking and heating, and urban air pollution from motor vehicles and electric power generation. Environmental disease burden is much higher in low-income countries than in high-income countries. However, in the case of certain non-communicable diseases, such as cardiovascular disease and cancer, the per capita disease burden is larger in high-income countries. Children bear the highest death toll, with more than 4 million environmentally caused deaths yearly, mostly from developing countries. The infant death rate from environmental causes is 12 times higher in low-income countries. All right, now, in epidemiologic studies of environmental factors, each factor is often analyzed in isolation. However, there are many ways in which environmental factors can influence each other's effects. Multi-causality and a clear hierarchy of causes are often evident. This may explain differences between the results of observational epidemiologic studies conducted in different locations. How environmental factors affect an individual also depends on other risk factor exposures and individual characteristics, these being age and sex, genetic factors, presence of disease, nutrition, personality, and physical condition. Occupational epidemiology is usually concerned with an adult population that is young or middle-aged and often predominantly male. In occupational epidemiology, most exposed persons are relatively healthy, at least when they have started to begin work. In contrast to this is environmental epidemiology. Environmental epidemiology explores associations between environmental factors and individuals of all ages, as well as individuals who are sick. Exposed people in the general population are likely to be more sensitive to such factors than workers in industry. This is of importance when the results of occupational epidemiologic studies are used to establish safety standards for specific environmental hazards. For example, the effects of lead occur at lower exposure levels in children than in adults. So this table here, lowest blood lead levels at which effects on health have been reported in children and adults. And then we see there the different levels between those two groups. Again, this is to illustrate that even though there may be occupational epidemiology, if you're doing work on that population, you can't always translate the findings to the general population. The main emphasis in environmental and occupational epidemiology has been on studies of the causes of disease. Specific preventative measures to reduce exposures and the impact of occupational health services also need evaluating. Exposure to hazardous environmental factors is often the result of some industrial or agricultural activity that brings economic benefit to the community, and the costs of eliminating these exposures can be considerable. So here's an example of a news article. I think there is recognition that coal may not be the best fuel source for the environment. However, when you recognize there's a potential problem, addressing that problem by eliminating coal can have definitely a large impact upon those in that population that require that for financial security. But in time, hopefully people can evolve, can adapt. So here's an example where trying to transition to a tourism economy, did it completely replace? I don't know the answer to that, but you can see how looking how epidemiology impacts an area, it can have that cause a big paradigm shift in how people live and work. Settlement blocks planned federal fracking leases in California. Now, again, these are some old examples here, but definitely how industry, how that impacts health plays a big factor in how things occur politically, right? And maybe I'm not saying that in an obvious way, but there's a lot of different factors at play. And sometimes who's in charge may influence what gets done. How do you balance all of that stuff? Environmental pollution, often costly in itself. Environmental pollution can damage agricultural land or industrial property and also impact people's health. Epidemiologic analyses, health impact assessments, and cost effectiveness analyses help public health authorities to find, hopefully, that acceptable balance between health risks and the economic costs of prevention. Now, examples of combined epidemiologic and economic analyses demonstrate the potential value of prevention. In 3 quote-unquote pollution diseases that occurred in the 1960s in Japan, it was calculated that the prevention would have been cheaper than the cure for each of those diseases. So table 9.3 here highlights the 3 different pollution diseases, the pollutants that were involved, the pollutant control costs, and pollution damage costs. And again, what they felt was that doing the prevention, doing the change up front was going to be less expensive than the cost of treating people and changing things after the fact. So environmental epidemiologic studies, or environmental epi, will face new challenges in the coming decades with changes in the global environment. Studies are needed of the health impacts of global climate change, depletion of the ozone layer, UV radiation, and aspects of population dynamics. Now, that is from the text. I am not an expert in those areas at all, but you get the point. This is an area where um, people continue to do work and realize that it has implications um, financially, politically, health wise for people. Hopefully, you got that message as we went through those slides. Interestingly, when we think about climate related activities and its impact upon health, a few years ago, I'm here in the Portland, Oregon area. A few years ago, we hit 114 degrees, June 28th of 2021. Now, the hottest days prior to that had been 99, 98, 99 in the years 2018 through 2020. That 114 where I live outside of the Portland area got as high as 116. So we had like a 3 or 4 day period where we had these really, really high temperatures. And from an epidemiologic perspective, how does that affect people's health? Well, we weren't ready for that. There were nearly 100 deaths, and a lot of people don't have air conditioning, especially people that might be lower income, live in apartments. You know, you can survive maybe a 95, 99 degree day when you have those spikes, but when we had 3 days in a row like that, that was pretty intense. And at the same time, there was a spot in Canada that hit 121 degrees. So I think epidemiologists would be interested in what are ways to reduce the risk of death as weather changes in response to heat. And so I think something that was done in the Portland, Oregon area was to try to identify populations that could benefit from cooling centers, or a recognition that air conditioning units probably needed to be in most apartment complexes. This is figure 9.1 from the text. This showing how climate change has an impact upon human health and the interrelationships between some of those different factors like land degradation, freshwater decline, biodiversity loss, and then, of course, how that impacts human health. It's a complicated situation. All right, let's talk about exposure and dose. Epidemiologic studies on the effects of environmental factors often deal with very specific factors that can be measured quantitatively. The concepts of exposure and dose are important in environmental and occupational epidemiology. Exposure has two dimensions, level and duration. For environmental factors that cause acute effects more or less immediately after exposure starts, the current exposure level determines whether effects occur. For instance, the London smog epidemic of deaths from lung and heart disease, as we see in this next slide, figure 9.2, one of the world's first major environmental disease outbreaks. In that London smog epidemic, you can see as the smoke levels rose and the parts per million rose of the pollutant, we saw the death rates also rise in a similar relationship. Now, many environmental factors produce effects only after a long period of exposure. So, chemicals that build up in the body or hazards that have an accumulative effect. So, for hazards like those, the past exposure levels and the exposure duration are important to understand. The total exposure or that external dose, it is often estimated, it is often approximated, and then used to determine what risk somebody might be at if they live or operate in a similar situation.